The prairie stretched wide under a pale autumn sky. It's the kind of sky that looked tired after summer's blaze, but not yet ready for winter's bite. Alone. Ryder made his way along the dirt trail, dust rising beneath the hooves of his horse. He was a rancher by trade, a man used to long days and longer nights, and silence had become his closest companion. This land lay several miles behind him, empty and quiet, with no sound but the wind and the restless cattle. Yet today he had left it all to ride farther than he usually dared, toward a stretch of country he seldom traveled. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but even then, anyone who caught a glimpse of him would have seen the weight carried there. Years of work, loss, and loneliness had etched themselves into the lines of his face. He wasn't a man seeking trouble, yet sometimes trouble found him just the same. The road was not unfamiliar, but his thoughts were elsewhere, and the trail split in ways he had not noticed before. His mind, heavy as it was, made him careless, and in his weariness he turned down the wrong path. The sun dipped lower, casting the land in shades of copper and gold. He kept riding, believing he was still on the way home, though the fences looked strange, and the wind carried the faint smell of smoke that wasn't his. A cabin came into sight in the distance, tucked near a grove of cottonwoods. Looked humble, maybe even forgotten, with its shutters crooked and the roof patched with mismatched boards. Yet the light of a fire glowed faintly from within, and that was enough to pull him closer. He thought perhaps it belonged to an old neighbor, someone he had overlooked in his years of keeping to himself. He dismounted slowly, his boots pressing into the dry earth. The air was cool now, filled with the faint sound of a whippoorwill calling from the trees. He tied his horse to the fence post, though the rails looked worn, almost ready to give way. The cabin seemed still, save for the curl of smoke from the chimney. He raised his hand, hesitated, then knocked softly against the weathered wood of the door. The door creaked open, not from his touch, but from the inside. A young boy, no more than 5 or 6, stood there. His hair was uncombed, his clothes a little too big for him, as if handed down more than once, but his eyes wide and innocent held something the rancher was not prepared for. The boy's lips trembled as he looked up at the tall figure before him, then his small voice broke the silence in a way that shook the man to his core. "Papa, you finally came back." The rancher froze. The boy's words echoed through him, cutting through years of silence he thought he had already grown used to. His hand, still hovering near the doorframe, dropped to his side as his breath caught in his chest. He had no children, no family waiting for him anywhere. Yet here stood a child, clinging to the hope that the man before him was the father who had left or perhaps had been taken too soon. Before he could speak, a woman's voice called from within the cabin, weary but firm. "Who's at the door?" The rancher looked past the boy, and in the dim glow of the firelight, he saw her step into view. A widow, he realized at once, though not because she wore black or carried herself in some dramatic way. It was in her eyes, the heavy sorrow she tried to keep steady for the sake of the child. Her hands were rough from work, her dress plain but clean, her hair tied back with strands falling loose from a long day's effort. She paused when her eyes fell on him, her lips parting as if she too recognized something in his face. The silence between them stretched long, filled only by the crackle of the fire inside. The boy pressed closer to the rancher's leg, holding on as if afraid the man might vanish. His small hands clutched tight, his voice trembling again. "Mama, I told you Papa would come." He came back like he promised. The woman's expression wavered, but she steadied herself quickly, as though she had lived too long with disappointment to let it show. "You've mistaken the man, child," she said gently, though her voice carried a hint of unease. She looked at the rancher again, almost searching his features. Then, with a tired breath, she added, "But it's late. If you've come this far, you might as well step in out of the cold." The rancher hesitated. Every part of him urged him to turn back, to explain, to leave before he brought confusion into a house already filled with longing and grief. Yet the child's grip on him was firm, and the widow's weary eyes seemed to hold an invitation that wasn't entirely spoken. He stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots, and the warmth of the fire reached him after the long chill of the ride. Inside, the cabin was simple, sparse furniture, a few tools hanging by the door, a quilt folded neatly on a chair. On the table lay a worn Bible and a tin plate with the remains of supper. The boy still clung to him, unwilling to let go. The widow busied herself with the fire, though her glances kept straying toward the stranger now sitting at her table. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, pressing against all three of them. The rancher finally cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "Ma'am, I think I might have lost my way. My land lies west of here, but I must have taken the wrong turn." She nodded slowly, though her eyes didn't leave him. "There aren't many who ride this far, unless they've got reason. It's a lonely stretch out here." The boy climbed into the chair beside him, watching him with quiet wonder, as though afraid to blink and lose him again. The rancher felt the weight of that gaze, heavier than any saddle he had carried. Something inside him shifted, though he could not name it. He had lived years without ties, years without anyone calling his name or waiting for his return. Yet here was a child who had claimed him without hesitation, and a widow whose silence seemed to carry questions she dared not ask. The night deepened, the fire burning lower. Outside, the wind whispered against the cabin walls, carrying with it the secrets of the land. Inside, the rancher sat at a table that wasn't his, in a house he had not meant to find. With a boy who called him father and a widow who looked at him as though fate itself had brought him to her door, he should have left already, mounted his horse, and ridden back toward his own land, before the darkness swallowed the trail. Yet something kept him there, rooted to the spot, unable to turn away.
The wrong house?
The wrong path, the wrong door, knocked on Anne's still. It felt like he had stepped into a place he was meant to find. The boy leaned against him, eyes drooping with sleep, whispering softly, "Don't go again, Papa. Please stay." The widow looked at him then, her gaze steady, waiting for the truth he had not spoken yet. The rancher's breath caught once more, his answer trapped somewhere between the man he was and the man this family seemed to need him to be. And in that fragile moment, as the firelight flickered and the shadows lengthened, he realized he could not decide whether he had wandered into a mistake or into the very beginning of something he had never dared to dream. The boy's soft breathing filled the cabin as he finally drifted into sleep, his small head resting against the rancher's arm. The man sat still, almost afraid to move, feeling the warmth of the child who wasn't his. Across the table, the widow sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching with a quiet intensity. The fire cracked low, shadows moving across the walls, and outside the wind carried the faint sound of coyotes. Neither of them spoke at first. It was as though words might shatter the fragile balance in that room. Finally, the widow rose and carefully lifted her son into her arms. She carried him to the narrow bed tucked in the corner, pulling the quilt up around him. When she turned back, her face was hard to read. She lingered near the fire before finally sitting again, her eyes meeting the rancher's in the dim glow. "You came from the west," you said. Her voice was steady, though it carried the faintest tremor. He nodded. "That's right. Got a spread near Dry Creek. Smaller than most, but it keeps me busy." She seemed to weigh his words, her gaze still fixed on him. "Dry Creek's a long way. Men don't often wander this far without reason." "I took the wrong road," he admitted, though the words felt shallow now, as though the truth was not so simple. Her lips pressed together, then parted slightly. "When my boy saw you at the door, he thought you were someone he's been waiting on, someone he'll never see again." The rancher shifted, uneasy with the weight of her meaning. He had no business in their lives, yet already he was tangled in the thread of their sorrow. He leaned back, his voice quiet. "I didn't mean to stir up pain, if I'd known." "You didn't know," she interrupted, though her tone softened. "It's not the first time he's called a stranger by that name. But tonight it hit him harder than I've seen before." The man lowered his eyes to the fire. He thought of the boy's face when he opened the door, how pure that hope had been. It stirred something in him he had long buried, something that reminded him of what it felt like to belong somewhere, to someone. Yet he had spent years building walls around himself. He had his cattle, his land, and his solitude. That was enough, he always told himself. But now, sitting here in a stranger's cabin, with a widow's sorrow and a child's hope pressing against him, those walls felt less steady. She reached across the table, then her hand brushing lightly against the rim of the cup near him. Her eyes were steady, though the sadness in them was plain. "It's been hard here since he passed. The boy doesn't remember him well, but he remembers enough. Enough to wait at the window some nights, whispering that his father might still ride home. The rancher swallowed hard, unsure what words could be spoken. He knew grief in his own way. He had buried people he cared for, watched them lowered into the ground, and returned to empty land with only silence as company. Yet the way she spoke carried a different weight. She wasn't just mourning a man. She was carrying a child's longing too, bearing both her loss and the boy's unanswered questions. "You've managed all this alone?"
Ow.
Her gaze flickered toward the shelves, the patched walls, the cracked floorboards. Alone is the only way left. There aren't many willing to come this far for work, and neighbors are few. Most days I make do. The rancher nodded, the fire's glow painting lines across his face. He could see the truth of her words in every corner of the cabin. The place bore marks of hard living. Tools worn thin, fabric patched and repatched, wood split and hammered back together, and still it held warmth. The fire burned steady, the boy slept sound, and the woman sat tall despite her weariness. He stayed seated, though a part of him urged him to stand, to leave before the night made him part of something he had no right to join. Yet when he shifted to speak, the widow raised her hand. "Stay a little longer. The boy will sleep easier if he wakes, and still sees you here." Her words settled heavy on him, gave a small nod, and silence stretched between them again. The fire sank lower, and the cabin filled with the kind of quiet that pressed against a man's thoughts. He thought of his own ranch, sitting empty tonight, no child's voice calling him home, no fire waiting at the hearth. He thought of the years he had lived without company, convincing himself it was the life he wanted. As the minutes passed, the widow finally spoke again, her voice soft. "What's your name?" He hesitated, then gave it. She repeated it once, almost to herself, then nodded. "It suits you. Strong, plain, steady." He managed a faint smile at that, though it carried little ease. He shifted his hands, folding them together on the table. "And yours?" She gave her name too, simple and strong, like the life she lived. He repeated it under his breath, and it lingered there, warming the space between them. The firelight flickered, catching the glimmer of her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence felt different now. Not just heavy, but expectant, like something was being built in the quiet. Something neither of them had asked for but couldn't turn away from. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The boy stirred in his sleep, mumbling faintly before settling again. The widow rose and tucked the quilt tighter around him, then sat back down. "Ah!" She looked at the rancher as though she had made a decision, though she didn't voice it yet. "You'll ride out in the morning?" she said softly, though her tone carried more question than command. He nodded slowly, though his chest felt tight. "That's the plan." She studied him, then gave the faintest shake of her head. "It feels like more than chance brought you here." The rancher held her gaze, but he had no answer. He didn't know why he had taken the wrong road, why he had come to this cabin, or why the boy's voice had struck him so deeply. He only knew that tonight he felt less like a man passing through, and more like someone standing at the edge of a choice he hadn't expected to face. The widow turned back toward the fire, her shoulders squared as though bracing herself against the thought of mourning. He watched her, the lines of sorrow etched into her face, the strength in the way she carried herself despite it. And he wondered, not for the first time, if he had stepped into the wrong place, or if fate had led him exactly where he needed to be. When the fire burned low, she rose and fetched another quilt from the shelf. She laid it across the back of the chair nearest him. "You can rest here tonight. It isn't much, but it's warmer than the trail." He looked at her, wanting to protest, yet he saw the firmness in her eyes. She wasn't asking. She was offering, and in that offer was trust. He gave a slow nod and murmured his thanks. As she moved to her own small bed in the corner opposite her son, the room settled into stillness again. The rancher leaned back in the chair, the quilt draped across his shoulders, and let the warmth of the fire carry him towards sleep.
Ow.
But his mind didn't quiet. It lingered on the boy's words, on the widow's sorrow, and on the strange feeling that his life had taken a turn the moment he knocked on this door. The land outside might stretch wide and empty, but inside this small cabin was a pull stronger than he had ever known. He closed his eyes, yet rest didn't come easy. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed that when morning broke, the choice before him would be clearer. And whatever road he chose, nothing would be the same again. The rancher woke before the sun, the first pale light creeping through the crooked shutters of the cabin. He sat still for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of the place, the faint crackle of dying embers, the slow breathing of the child, and the quiet rustle as the widow stirred beneath her quilt. For a man used to waking to nothing but the howl of wind across empty land, the sound of life inside four walls struck him in an unexpected way. He rose carefully, pulling the quilt from his shoulders, and stepped to the window. The land outside stretched wide and silent, but different than his own, less open, hemmed in by trees and a ridge that caught the early light. He thought of leaving before they woke, of slipping out to his horse and riding west, until this cabin was nothing but a memory. Yet his boots felt heavy. His hand lingered on the latch, and when he glanced back, he saw the boy shifting under his blanket, murmuring words that broke whatever plan he had to ride away unseen. The widow rose soon after, her hair loose around her face, her eyes carrying that same quiet strength he had noticed the night before. She met his gaze and spoke softly, careful not to wake her son. "There's coffee if you'd like some." He nodded, settling back at the table while she poured. The smell filled the cabin, sharp and earthy, and he realized how long it had been since he'd shared a morning with anyone at all. His life back at Dry Creek was built on routines: feed the stock, mend the fences, ride the range. Every day ran into the next with nothing but the seasons to mark the passing of time. Here, even with sorrow heavy in the air, there was a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. The boy woke soon after, rubbing his eyes and glancing around until they landed on the rancher. Small face brightened with relief. "You didn't leave, Papa." The words hit the man's chest with a force he couldn't explain. He opened his mouth to speak, but the widow cut in gently, her tone steady. "Mind your manners, son. Let the man have his coffee before you go asking questions." But the boy didn't look away, his eyes locked on the rancher with a trust that seemed too heavy for one man to bear. After breakfast, the rancher stepped outside to tend his horse, the cold morning air biting at his face. He checked the saddle, tightened the cinch, and stroked the animal's neck, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the way the boy had looked at him, or the way the widow's eyes seemed to search him, as if she too wondered why fate had put him on her doorstep. She joined him a little later, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. For a long moment she said nothing, just watched him work with the horse. Then, in a voice quieter than before, she asked, "What kind of man are you really?" He paused, turning to meet her eyes. "The kind who works hard, keeps to himself, and has no business being mistaken for someone else's kin." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't look away. "You don't strike me as a man who keeps to himself by choice." That stung more than he expected. He turned back to the horse, tightening the reins, though his thoughts churned. She wasn't wrong. He had once been a man who dreamed of more, who had hoped for a family of his own, but life had hardened him. Loss had stripped him of those dreams, and the emptiness of the range had become his only companion. The widow stepped closer, lowering her voice. "My boy needs something he can hold on to. I've given him what I can, but there are things only a man can teach. Things he's been longing for, sees you and believes his prayers were answered." The rancher's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her not to put that weight on him, not to build hope where there was none. But before he could speak, the boy burst out of the cabin, clutching a small wooden horse in his hand. "Papa, will you come with me to the creek? I want to show you where I fish." The widow's eyes held his, silently asking him to play along. Against his better judgment, he nodded, and the boy's face lit with joy. They walked down the narrow path that wound through the trees, the boy skipping ahead, chattering about minnows and smooth stones. The rancher listened, his silence mistaken for interest, though in truth he was struggling against the pull of the moment. At the creek, the boy crouched near the water, pointing out where he claimed to have caught the biggest trout of his life. The rancher knelt beside him, watching the way the boy's eyes shone with excitement. For a brief moment, something in him softened, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Yet it was followed quickly by unease. He was not this boy's father, and pretending otherwise felt like standing on dangerous ground. On their way back, the boy slipped his small hand into the rancher's. The simple gesture nearly undid him. He let it rest there longer than he should have before pulling away gently as they neared the cabin. Inside, the widow was preparing a stew, her movements steady but her expression unreadable. She glanced up when they entered, her eyes lingering on the rancher's face before shifting to her son. "Did you show him the place?" "Yes, Mama," the boy said proudly. "And Papa said he liked it." Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. As the day stretched on, the rancher found himself caught in a strange tension. Part of him longed to mount his horse and leave, to return to the solitude of his ranch. Another part felt rooted here, pulled by a boy's innocent faith and a widow's unspoken plea. Every glance she gave him seemed to hold both gratitude and fear, as though she too was torn between what she wanted and what she knew to be dangerous. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, a knock rattled against the door. The widow stiffened, her ladle pausing mid-stir. The boy looked up wide-eyed, and the rancher reached instinctively for the revolver at his side. The knock came again, louder this time. A rough voice followed. "Open up! We know you're in there." The widow's face drained of color. She motioned for her son to stay quiet, then whispered to the rancher, "It's them." He frowned, lowering his voice. "Who?" She shook her head, her eyes sharp with fear. "Men from the ridge. They've been here before, pressing me for what I don't have. I told them no, but they don't take kindly to being refused." The knock turned into a pounding, and the boy clung to his mother's skirt, trembling. The rancher moved closer to the door, his hand firm on the revolver, though his mind raced. He had no stake in this fight, no reason to defend a home that wasn't his. Yet when he glanced back and saw the widow's fear in the boy's wide, trusting eyes, the decision no longer felt so simple. "Stay back," he told them quietly, his voice steady, though his chest was tight. The pounding stopped, replaced by the sound of boots shifting on the porch. Then came the scrape of a voice that carried a cruel edge. "We'll give you one chance, widow. I'll hand it over, or next time we don't come asking polite." The rancher pressed his back against the wall, listening, his jaw tightening. He didn't know what they wanted, but he knew danger when he heard it. The widow's eyes met his, full of fear and something else, something like a plea for him not to leave her to face this alone. The boy's whisper broke the silence. "Papa, don't let them take us." The words struck deeper than any bullet could. The rancher gripped his revolver tighter, his heart pounding. He'd stumbled into this cabin by mistake. But now, he was standing at the edge of something bigger, something that would demand more of him than he had ever given. And as the men outside shifted, muttering to one another, the widow's gaze held him fast, waiting for the choice he hadn't yet spoken. The night seemed to hold its breath, the firelight flickering against the walls, the boy clutching his mother. The rancher poised between walking away or stepping into a battle that was not his, but felt like it might become his fate. The rancher kept still against the wall, every sense sharpened as the night pressed in heavy around the cabin. The men outside shifted their boots on the porch boards, their voices low but filled with a promise of trouble. The boy clung tighter to his mother, and the widow's face was pale in the glow of the fire. Her eyes locked on the man who now stood between her and whatever storm was waiting at the door. The rough voice called again. "Don't make us come back tomorrow, widow. You know what belongs to us? Hand it over, or we'll take more than you can spare." The rancher's grip on the revolver tightened. He didn't know what the men were after, but he didn't need to. He could hear the cruelty in their tone, the hunger of men who wanted power over someone weaker. It stirred something in him, something he thought he'd left behind years ago, when he chose solitude over the weight of caring. The widow shook her head, her whisper barely audible. "They won't stop. They'll bleed this place dry if they can. Told them I have nothing, but they don't believe me." The boy looked up at the rancher, eyes wide with a trust that cut straight through him. "Papa, you'll stop them, won't you?" The word made his chest tighten. He wasn't this child's father, but the plea in that voice demanded an answer all the same. He gave the boy a small nod, steadying him, though inside he was torn. He had no reason to stay, no promise tying him here. Yet walking away now would mean leaving them to the mercy of men he already knew had none. Outside, the men cursed under their breath, one spitting into the dirt. "We'll give her till next sundown. After that, we don't ask twice." Their boots thudded down the porch steps, fading into the dark. But the echo of their threat lingered like smoke inside the cabin. The widow sank into a chair, her shoulders sagging. The boy pressed against her side, whispering questions she couldn't answer. The rancher slid his revolver back into its holster, though his hand lingered near it. He walked to the window, looking out into the dark. The ridge loomed in the distance, black against the sky, and he wondered how many men sat waiting there, how long this fight had been brewing before he ever set foot at this door. When he turned back, the widow was watching him. Her eyes carried both gratitude and fear, as though she was glad he had been there tonight, but afraid of what it meant for tomorrow. "You don't owe us anything," she said softly, though the words trembled. "If you ride out come morning, I won't blame you." He studied her, his jaw tight, "and leave you to face them alone." Her lips pressed together and she looked away. "I've faced worse already." A woman learns to stand her ground when she's got no choice. The boy clutched her hand, his voice small. "But he's here now. He won't leave us." The rancher's chest ached at the sound, torn between truth and hope. He had never been a man to make promises lightly, and here was a promise being written for him by the trust of a child and the silence of a widow who wouldn't ask but couldn't hide her need. That night stretched long, sleep coming in restless scraps. Every sound outside made him reach for the revolver. Every creak of the wind felt like boots on the porch. When dawn broke, gray and heavy, he stepped outside to the cold air and found himself scanning the ridge as though expecting to see shadows moving against the light. The widow came to stand beside him, her shawl pulled tight. She followed his gaze toward the ridge. "There were 3 of them last time. This time 4. Next time, I don't know how many." He asked what they wanted, his voice low. She hesitated, then sighed. "My husband. Before he died, he borrowed from them. He promised he'd pay it back after harvest, but he never made it that far. They came after, claiming the debt was mine to bear. I told them I had nothing. They didn't believe me, and each time they come, they demand more." The rancher nodded slowly, anger stirring in him. Men who preyed on widows and children had no honor, no right to walk free. Still, he knew, taking a stand against them would draw blood, and blood once spilled never washed away clean. All that day, he stayed close. He helped mend the fence that sagged along the edge of the property, chopped wood for the fire, and fetched water from the creek. The boy followed at his heels, eager to show him every corner of the place, every hidden trail and hollow tree. The widow watched them, her expression softening at times, though shadows never fully left her eyes. As the sun dipped low again, painting the land in red and gold, the tension in the air grew sharp. The boy sensed it too, clinging close to the rancher, as though afraid he might vanish before the danger came. The widow prepared supper with slow, deliberate movements, her silence heavy. When night fell, the rancher checked his revolver again, then fetched the rifle from where it hung on the wall. He ran his fingers along the worn stock, feeling the weight of it. He had carried rifles plenty in his life, but tonight felt different. Tonight it wasn't just his own skin he was defending. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from the ridge. The widow stiffened, her hand pausing mid-stir, and the boy's eyes went wide. The rancher set the rifle down carefully, his jaw tightening. He knew what was coming, and he knew there would be no easy way out of it. The laughter faded, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against the walls. Then slowly the sound of boots on gravel grew closer. The boy darted to the rancher's side, gripping his hand. The widow's eyes met his, filled with fear, but also something fiercer, a kind of unspoken resolve. The pounding came again at the door, harder this time, shaking the frame. The same voice snarled through the wood. "Time's up, widow. Pay what's owed, or watch what happens when you cross us." The boy trembled, whispering desperately, "Papa, don't let them in." The widow held her breath, her gaze steady on the rancher. This time she didn't tell him he could leave, didn't tell him he didn't owe them anything. She said nothing at all, because the truth was plain in her eyes. The rancher stepped toward the door, rifle in hand, his shadow stretching across the cabin floor. His heart pounded, but his grip was steady. He was a man who had lived years with nothing, and now, by mistake or by fate, he had found something that made the fight worth taking. The men outside grew restless, cursing, threatening, their fists hammering against the wood. The boy clung to his mother, whispering prayers under his breath, while the widow watched the man by the door as though he carried every hope she had left. The rancher stood tall, his breath slow, his finger brushing the trigger. He knew the next moments would decide everything: the widow's safety, the boy's future, and his own path. The cabin walls seemed to close in, the fire snapping sharp in the silence. Then the pounding stopped. The air was so still it rang in his ears. And in that stillness, he heard the scrape of metal, the sound of a latch being tried, the shuffle of more boots than before. The rancher raised the rifle, his body tensing as the door began to give under the force outside. The boy whispered one last plea.
Oh.
Please don't leave us, Papa. And in that charged breath before the storm broke, the rancher understood there was no turning back, no riding away. Whatever happened next, it would happen with him standing his ground in that cabin, staring into the eyes of the danger he had never meant to find, but could no longer walk away from. The door shuddered. Under the weight of fists and boots, the wood groaning as if it might splinter at any second. The rancher stood planted before it, rifle braced against his shoulder, every muscle ready. The widow held her son close, whispering to calm him, though her own voice trembled. The fire crackled low, casting shadows that danced along the cabin walls, and the night outside pressed in, heavy with the promise of violence. With a crash, the latch gave way, the door swinging inward. Figures spilled through the threshold, rough men with hard eyes and the stink of whiskey on their breath. The rancher fired the first shot, the crack splitting the air like thunder. One man cried out, stumbling back into the night. The others hesitated, caught off guard by the stranger who now guarded the widow's home. "You picked the wrong house," the rancher growled, his voice low and steady. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a frightened woman alone, not a man standing tall with a rifle steady in his hands. Still their leader stepped forward, sneering. "You've got no say in this. We came for what's ours, and we'll take it." The rancher's eyes narrowed. "There's nothing here for you but trouble." The standoff hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, with a curse, another of the men lunged forward. The rancher's rifle barked again, the report echoing through the trees. Chaos followed shouts, the stomp of boots, the clatter of overturned chairs. The widow shielded her son, pulling him close beneath the table. Smoke filled the cabin, sharp and stinging, but the rancher moved like a man who had known battles before. At last the remaining men stumbled back into the dark, dragging their wounded and cursing with every step. The leader lingered at the edge of the porch, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat. "We'll be back, and next time you won't be so lucky." The rancher stepped into the doorway, rifle still in hand. "Next time you'll wish you never set foot on this land." The man scowled, then turned and vanished into the night, his boots pounding down the path. Silence fell, broken only by the widow's soft sobs and the boy's uneven breaths. For a long moment no one moved. Then the rancher lowered the rifle, his chest heaving as the weight of what had just passed settled on him. He turned to the widow, his voice quieter now. "You're safe, for tonight." Her eyes glistened with tears, though her chin lifted with the same strength he had seen from her before. "They'll be back," she whispered. "They don't forget." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll be here when they come." The boy crawled out from beneath the table, his small hands clutching the rancher's coat. "I knew you wouldn't let them hurt us, Papa." The rancher looked down at him, his throat tight. He had no claim to the title, no right to answer to it. Yet in the boy's eyes he saw a faith so pure it felt like a bond, stronger than blood. He rested a hand gently on the child's shoulder, unable to speak the truth that threatened to break the moment. The rest of the night passed in a haze. The widow patched the door as best she could, while the rancher kept watch, rifle across his knees. The boy fell asleep against his mother's side, clutching the wooden horse he carried everywhere. The rancher stared into the fire, his thoughts heavy. He had come to this place by mistake, yet it felt less and less like a mistake with every passing hour. When dawn broke, painting the land in pale gold, the widow set a cup of coffee before him. Her hands trembled slightly, though her eyes held steady when she met his. "You don't have to stay," she said, though her voice was softer than before. He studied her for a long moment, then looked toward the boy still curled in sleep. "If I ride away now, they'll come back, and you'll be alone again. Can't leave you like that." The widow's lips parted as though she wanted to protest, but instead she let out a shaky breath. "It's not your fight." The rancher shook his head. "Maybe not. But it became mine the moment that door opened." The days that followed carried a tension that never quite lifted. The rancher worked alongside the widow, repairing fences, reinforcing the cabin, making sure the land showed signs of strength instead of weakness. The boy followed him everywhere, chattering about fishing holes and hidden trails, his laughter echoing across the fields in a way that softened even the hardest hours. At night, the rancher kept watch by the fire, the rifle always within reach. Sometimes the widow joined him, sitting in silence, the crackle of the flames filling the space between them. Other times, she spoke of her husband, of the debt he had left behind, of the burden she had carried alone. The rancher listened, his heart heavy, yet with every word he felt himself drawn deeper into the life he had stumbled upon. The men from the ridge did return, though never in the same numbers, and each time they were met with resistance they hadn't expected. The rancher stood firm, his steady aim and quiet resolve enough to turn them back. Word spread that the widow was no longer alone, and soon the threats grew fewer. Still, the memory of that first night lingered, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned red, the boy climbed into the rancher's lap, his small hands gripping the man's coat. "Will you always stay with us, Papa?" The question hung in the air, heavy and final. The rancher felt the widow's eyes on him, waiting, her own heart caught between fear and hope. He looked at the boy, then at the woman who had carried so much strength through so much loss. And for the first time in years, he felt the walls around his own heart begin to break. "I'll stay," he said softly, the words more promise than he had ever given before. The boy's face lit with joy, and the widow's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. The rancher pulled them both close, the fire crackling low as night settled over the land. In the days that followed, life did not become easier, but it became shared. The rancher's solitude gave way to laughter and small joys, to the steady rhythm of a family he had never expected to find. The widow found her burden lighter, her steps stronger, with someone to lean on. And the boy, who had once waited at the window for a father who would never return, no longer waited at all. The wrong road had led the rancher to the wrong house, but in that mistake he had found something greater than the life he had left behind. He had found a reason to fight, a reason to stay, a reason to hope again. The prairie stretched wide and endless around them, the land still harsh, the nights still long. Yet inside the small cabin there was warmth, and where once there had been only silence, now there was the sound of voices, of laughter, of belonging. The rancher had come to the door as a stranger. He stayed as something more. And as the seasons turned, the land outside carried its trials. But within those walls, there was a family built not by chance, but by the choice to stand, to protect, and to love. In the end, the rancher understood what the boy had seen from the start. Sometimes a man doesn't need blood to be a father, or promises of the past to be a husband. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stay when leaving would have been easier. And so the story of the lonely rancher, who had lost his way and stumbled upon a widow's home, was no longer a tale of mistake, but of finding exactly what he didn't know he had been searching for all along.